In 1800, the mightiest military superpower on Earth, the British Royal Navy, was brought to its knees completely overnight.
Yeah, just paralyzed.
Right. And not by a fleet of enemy warships,
Yeah.
not by a sudden lack of gunpowder or timber. They were functionally paralyzed by a lack of plant fiber.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. Like, you always see these paintings of the British fleet at the absolute height of its power, and you focus on the massive wooden hulls and the imposing black iron cannons.
Oh, absolutely. The classic imagery.
Exactly. It projects this undeniable self-sufficient global dominance. But the reality of how you actually project that power across an ocean comes down to the literal threads holding the entire imperial machine together.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about hemp.
Yeah, it completely shifts your perspective on naval history. Like, you strip away the romance of the high seas and you are left with the raw structural reality of wind-powered warfare. Because a ship of the line in that era wasn't just floating, it was a complex machine of tension and leverage. And the mechanism driving that machine was literally miles and miles of rope.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are going to explore how the British Empire's legendary naval dominance was actually built on a massive, highly vulnerable, and frankly terrifying global supply chain of fiber.
It really is a story about how a simple weed shaped global geopolitics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the story actually starts incredibly close to home for the British, long before they were a global superpower.
Yes, right in their own backyard.
Right. Before they ever had to worry about global supply chains, they were sourcing this in a place called Bridport.
Yeah, Bridport down in Dorset. I mean, if we go all the way back to the 1200s, England was already utilizing local hemp and flax to make rope and cable for royal ships.
So it started out as a pretty localized thing.
Exactly, a very localized domestic industry. But to understand why they were so obsessed with hemp specifically, we need to look at its biology. Because you might wonder, why not just use wool or cotton or whatever else was lying around?
Right, because my mind immediately goes to cotton. I mean, it seems like it would be much easier to grow and weave, right?
Well, cotton is great for clothes, but it is terrible for the ocean.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it just rots. Hemp, on the other hand, has these incredibly long, bast fibers running the length of the plant's stalk. They are bound together by pectin, which makes them incredibly strong.
Okay, that makes sense.
But more importantly, hemp is naturally resistant to saline environments. Salt water destroys almost everything, but hemp can withstand the corrosive spray of the ocean far better than, other natural fibers.
Wow. So it's not just a convenient crop. It is a highly specialized military material.
Precisely.
And I imagine as the Navy evolved from these relatively small medieval vessels into those towering ships of the line with multiple masts and complex rigging, this couldn't just remain a quaint local farming project.
No, not at all.
The infrastructure required to process this must have been massive.
Oh, it was. At a certain point, hemp ceased to be just an agricultural crop. It became essentially heavy industrial infrastructure. And this leads to what historians call the ropewalk state.
Oh, I love that term, the ropewalk state.
It's very fitting.
Now, if you were making rigging for a warship, I imagine you can't just weave it in a barn. To get ropes thick enough to anchor a multi-ton warship, you'd need, dedicated facility.
Exactly. You have to imagine the naval dockyards of the era. They weren't just places where you parked ships or constructed the wooden hulls.
Right.
They doubled as sprawling factories. And the defining features of these dockyards were the ropewalks, these incredibly long covered buildings. I mean, some of them stretched for over a quarter of a mile long.
Wait, a quarter of a mile? Just for one building?
Yes.
Why wouldn't they just make shorter ropes and tie them or splice them together? That seems like a massive waste of real estate.
Well, it comes down to the physics of tension. Every time you splice two ropes together, you create a structural weak point.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if you are relying on that cable to hold a mainmast steady in a hurricane or to hoist a 2-ton anchor, a weak point can literally sink the ship.
That would be a disaster.
Exactly. So to get maximum tensile strength, you physically need to stretch and twist the raw fiber continuously in one unbroken length.
Wow.
The workers would literally walk backward for hundreds of yards, carrying bundles of hemp around their waists, just feeding it into spinning wheels to twist the yarns.
That is insane. So they were taking the raw plant fiber, treating it, and twisting it under immense tension. And then they had to waterproof it, right? Because I know tar was a massive part of a sailor's life.
Oh, yes. Alongside the rope walks, you had enormous hemp warehouses and specialized tar houses.
Okay.
They would take these massive finished cables and run them through vats of boiling pine tar. The smell must have been just overwhelming, not to mention the constant risk of burning the entire dockyard to the ground.
Man, it makes me think of a modern-day, vertically integrated tech gigafactory.
That's a great way to look at it.
You know, like how a major electric car company doesn't just assemble vehicles. They build the battery manufacturing plant right next to the assembly line.
Yes, exactly.
The Royal Navy wasn't just building ships. They were manufacturing the fundamental means of propulsion and control right there on the water.
That is a highly accurate comparison. I mean, the rigging is the engine of a sailing ship. Without it, you just have a very expensive wooden fortress sitting motionless in the water.
Right.
But bringing that production in-house created a new problem, which was feeding the machine. The scale of the raw material required was just staggering.
And that scale is exactly where the local Dorset farms run into a massive mathematical wall. Let's put this into perspective for you listening. Think about the Spanish Armada in 1588.
A huge moment.
This was a defining existential moment for England. They are facing a massive invasion fleet, and outfitting the English defending fleet required hemp from roughly 10,000 cultivated acres.
Just an unbelievable amount.
Yeah, just for the cordage and the sailcloth. To help visualize that, 10,000 acres is about 15 square miles.
Wow.
That is the size of the entire island of Manhattan, from the Battery all the way up to Inwood. Imagine taking all of Manhattan, bulldozing it, and planting nothing but hemp just to rig one single fleet.
And you have to remember the fundamental geographic reality here. England is an island.
Right.
Arable land is strictly finite. You need land to grow wheat, to graze sheep, to sustain a growing population.
You can't just pave it all over with hemp.
Exactly. Dedicating the equivalent of Manhattan purely to ship rope is an incredible allocation of resources. It basically creates a structural bottleneck.
Right, because if your navy is growing and your global ambition is growing, but your island physically isn't getting any bigger, you have to look outward. You literally outgrow your own soil.
Precisely. England could not grow enough domestically to satisfy the beast they had created, so they were forced to look eastward.
Eastward, like where?
Well, in the 1550s, the Muscovy Company opened up trade routes through Arkhangelsk.
Wait, Arkhangelsk?
Yeah.
Which is right up in the freezing north of Russia on the White Sea. That is not an easy commute.
No, it was a brutal, incredibly dangerous maritime route, but it was absolutely necessary. Russia had vast expanses of land, ideal soil conditions for hemp, and frankly, incredibly cheap surf labor to harvest it.
Okay, so it was an economic decision too.
Yeah. So through Arkhangelsk, the English started funneling Russian hemp, flax, tar, timber, and cordage back home. It became an absolute lifeline.
Wow.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you see a total transformation in the supply chain. Because this wasn't just a temporary patch, this became the new normal.
Right.
By the late 1700s, local English hemp is basically a rounding error. Over 90% of the Royal Navy's hemp is coming from Russia, flowing in through the Baltic Sea.
Wait, 90%?
90%. It is an almost incomprehensible level of dependency for a critical military asset.
Okay, I really have to push back on this because it seems like sheer madness. If your navy is literally the only thing protecting your island from a French invasion, isn't relying on a foreign power and a major geopolitical rival, for 90% of your engine parts, a terrifying strategic vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely.
Was the Admiralty just ignoring this, or were they asleep at the wheel?
They absolutely weren't asleep. It was the definition of a structural vulnerability, and it terrified them. The Admiralty and the Board of Trade openly agonized over their entrenched dependence on what they called Riga hemp.
Right, referring to the major Baltic port where it was shipped from.
Exactly. They knew perfectly well that they were exposed.
I would be losing my mind. You have this magnificent world-beating fleet, but the Tsar of Russia essentially has his hand on the off switch. If he gets angry and stops the hemp shipments, your ships inevitably rot in their docks.
Exactly. Because ropes wear out. In heavy weather, rigging snaps. A ship needs constant replenishment.
Yeah, it's not a one-and-done thing.
No, without that Baltic pipeline, the Royal Navy had a shelf life of maybe a year or two. It was an intolerable risk for a nation trying to build a self-sustaining empire.
So what did they do?
Well, the British government goes into problem-solving mode. They attempt a frantic, empire-wide push to reshape global agriculture. They start floating proposals explicitly calling for substituting Virginian for Russian fiber.
Virginian, as in the American colonies. Okay, so they want to shift the burden of production away from a foreign rival and onto their own colonial possessions.
Exactly.
That makes logical sense. But you can't just snap your fingers and tell farmers across the Atlantic to completely change their crops overnight.
No, you can't. Which is why Parliament stepped in with massive economic incentives. They offered colonial bounties, paying out between 6 to 8 pounds per ton, specifically to incentivize colonial farmers to grow hemp.
Let's contextualize that money for a second. 6 to 8 pounds per ton back in the 1700s.
It was a lot.
Yeah, if I'm an average colonial farmer in Virginia, or a skilled tradesman making maybe 40 or 50 pounds in an entire year, an 8-pound bonus for a single ton of crop is a massive subsidy.
Huge.
They are artificially inflating the market to force a geopolitical outcome.
They were trying to. It was a massive subsidy, but here's the fascinating friction of history. It largely didn't work. The economic incentive couldn't overcome the physical reality of the plant.
Wait, why not? If the money is that good, why wouldn't every farmer in Virginia just plant hemp?
Two main reasons, really. Labor and soil exhaustion. Hemp is incredibly taxing on the soil. It strips nutrients rapidly.
Okay.
But more importantly, processing it is miserable work. To extract those strong bast fibers, you have to go through a process called retting.
Retting? What's that?
You basically have to leave the harvested stalks in stagnant ponds or slow-moving streams to let the outer bark rot away.
Oh, that sounds incredibly pleasant.
It is horrific. It smells like death, it pollutes the local water supply, and it requires back-breaking, specialized labor to separate the fibers once they've rotted.
Oh.
So colonial farmers quickly realized that even with the bounty, growing tobacco was vastly more profitable and far less putrid.
That perfectly explains the friction. You could throw all the money in the world at a problem, but if the daily reality for the worker is that miserable, the supply chain won't shift.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because this desperate search for ship rope doesn't stop at the Atlantic. When the American colonies fail to deliver, the panic drives them to literally shape the map of the world. It drives them all the way to the Pacific.
Yeah, the Pacific expansion is one of the most revealing chapters in this entire story. It demonstrates the sheer existential reach of this supply panic.
Because when you think of Captain James Cook, you naturally think of the grand romance of exploration, right? Charting the stars, mapping the unknown. But in 1774, when he is scouting Norfolk Island, this tiny speck of land near Australia, he isn't just marveling at the scenery. He's looking at it with a highly utilitarian military lens.
He definitely was.
He is walking the beaches looking for weeds. He specifically notes the Norfolk pines, thinking they would make perfect ship masts. And he finds these local flax-like plants that he believes could be woven into naval rope.
Right. Cook was essentially conducting a scavenger hunt for naval survival. He is evaluating a remote island on the other side of the planet purely on its potential to break the Russian monopoly.
That's amazing.
And the British government didn't just file his notes away. They acted on this intelligence. A man named Philip Gidley King was later explicitly tasked with settlement efforts on Norfolk Island, directly tied to securing these naval stores.
They are trying to build a Pacific supply outpost from scratch. I mean, the ambition is staggering.
It really is.
They are sailing months away from home, looking at a plant they've barely studied, hoping it can somehow scale up fast enough to replace the massive, established Baltic supply chain. It really highlights how desperate they were to find a backup plan.
It was an incredible gamble. They were trying to diversify their portfolio of dependencies, knowing that the clock was ticking. They knew the Russian bubble was going to burst eventually.
Which raises an important question, though. Did they make it in time? Because despite turning the entire globe into this frantic scavenger hunt, turning to the Americas, pushing into the Pacific, it doesn't seem like they ever quite caught up. The British government's absolute worst-case scenario eventually comes true.
It did. The vulnerability they had dreaded for centuries finally triggered a massive geopolitical crisis. We arrive at the year 1800.
Okay, set the scene.
Britain is locked in a fierce, draining war with France. The continent is in absolute chaos. And right in the middle of this existential conflict, Tsar Paul I of Russia makes his move.
He flips the off switch.
He flips the switch. Tsar Paul officially embargoes British ships and Russian ports. He completely cuts off their access to Russian hemp and naval stores.
Boom. 90% of your rigging material gone overnight.
Just vanished.
And this isn't peacetime. You are actively fighting a war against the French. Your ships are blockading enemy ports, fighting heavy weather, tearing through their rigging at an accelerated rate.
Exactly.
If they can't refit, the blockade collapses. The panic in the Admiralty that morning must have been absolute.
It was a catastrophic realization of their deepest fears. The Tsar effectively put a chokehold on the very ligaments of the Royal Navy.
But what happened?
This overnight crisis pushed Britain into a total scramble. They couldn't wait for Norfolk Island to slowly develop. They frantically explored every corner of their influence for emergency alternatives. They looked to India, they looked to Canada, they looked to Ireland, desperately hoping one of these regions could scale up production immediately.
But scaling up agriculture takes seasons. You can't just spawn 10,000 acres of processed hemp out of thin air.
You really can't.
And we all know the traditional narrative of the British Empire. It is usually portrayed as this unstoppable juggernaut that bends the world to its will. They always find a way to win.
Right, but what's fascinating here is the historical reality check. Despite the immense wealth poured into American bounties, despite the botanical exploration in the remote Pacific, despite the absolute panic of the 1800 embargo, the colonies never fully replaced Baltic hemp before 1800.
Wow, so they failed. The grand strategy to become an entirely self-sufficient empire just didn't work.
It did not. The policy efforts were massive, but the execution, the labor friction, and the sheer scale required were simply too great to shift in time.
That's incredible.
Yeah, England's naval rise, the very foundation of its global power, ran on hemp, and the vast majority of it remained imported from a foreign power right up until that breaking point.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and look at this entire journey, from the local fields of Bridport to the freezing ports of the Baltic, all the way to the beaches of the Pacific, it completely shatters the mythology we are usually taught.
It really does.
We are sold this idea of complete imperial independence. But this deep dive shows that the empire actually rested on something much more fragile. It rested on the delicate, high-stakes management of dependence.
That is the crucial takeaway. It was a constant balancing act. The dominance of the Royal Navy was not an inherent given. It was conditionally leased based on their ability to maintain that Baltic lifeline, and when that failed, to frantically pivot and survive the friction.
Wow.
Hemp wasn't the only story of the empire, but it was absolutely one of the most critical invisible fibers holding the entire structure together.
It is an incredible story. To quickly recap for you listening, we started in the local ropewalks of Bridport in the 1200s, where making rope was basically a domestic chore.
Yeah, humble beginnings.
Then we saw the scale explode with the Armada, requiring the equivalent of Manhattan and farmland, forcing that massive pivot to the brutal waters of Arkhangelsk. That created a terrifying reality where 90% of the Navy's lifeblood came from a foreign rival, which sparked a panic that drove massive cash bounties in the Americas and sent James Cook searching for weeds in the remote Pacific.
A global scavenger hunt.
And it all culminated in that 1800 crisis, where Tsar Paul pulled the plug, proving that the empire was never truly self-sufficient at all. Hemp was the quiet, unsung hero and the ultimate vulnerability of the high seas.
It really redefines how we should look at the mechanics of power. True power isn't just about the weapons you wield. It is about the mundane supply chains you can or cannot control.
Perfectly said. And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Yeah.
We just spent all this time looking at how a global superpower in the 1800s was fundamentally at the mercy of another nation for a basic plant fiber just to keep its military functioning.
Right.
So it makes you wonder, what are the invisible fibers of today's empires?
It is a profound question. I mean, the materials change, but the vulnerabilities remain.
Exactly. Would seemingly mundane raw materials, perhaps rare earth minerals hidden inside the microchips of our fighter jets, or specialized fiber optic cables running silently across the ocean floor, are modern superpowers entirely dependent on right now?
Things we barely even think about.
Yeah. And how fragile is our whole system without the average citizen ever realizing that the modern equivalent of Tsar Paul could flip the switch tomorrow?
It is a chilling parallel to consider.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone. Keep questioning the invisible threads.